مرحبا أنا حلا عامر واليوم I'm going to be tackling the topic of Arab cities and colonialism. So basically we're gonna start talking about the historical perspective, then the colonization in Egypt, architecture as a system of appropriation, then the British and the French attitude, then I'm going to be talking about Egypt, specifically about Iskandariya and Qahira. But then I'm going to be tackling the conclusions. So, the historical perspective, the world war just has finally started to recover from. The world has just finally recovered from World War I in 1919, and the world leaders met in Paris to launch the peace conference and the peace process, hoping to have to deal with not yet another large conflict. But before the peace conference has begun, several Western European countries they reached out to the agreements that would govern the areas after the war. And the agreement were specifically applicable for the Middle East, an area that was really affected by the war. This is the opening session of the Paris Peace Conference. So the world leaders were charged of redrawing Eastern Europe as a large portion of the Middle East during the peace conference. But this was a very massive undertaking, even for the most powerful leaders. They struggled with that. But thankfully, and كان في a lot of European countries representatives for that was easy. But unfortunately, that was not the case for the Middle East, because there was not a lot of representatives. But so the big three were able to decide what could be done with the area. So Britain and France took the lead in the negotiations for the area, hoping to gain more significant benefits. So there were likely more to claim lands to their own because they had most of the experience and colonial rule, and they wanted to pursue change and to modernize the areas they wanted to claim. This is a picture of the Big Three and the Paris Peace Conference. The Big Three are the United States, France, and Great Britain. Germany was not invited into the Paris Peace Conference, and Russia could not attend because of its civil war. So basically, the shaping of the Middle East during the mandate period was affected by colonialism. This will be the subject of this presentation, and also I will look at the importance of nationalism in each country and how it influenced the development of modern states. Colonization in Egypt. So when a foreign power takes a position of a nation and it colonizes it leaves its traces. Well, those traces can be political, economical, urban, architectural, nature. Like the most important one and the one that gives a powerful reminder, I think, is the visual trace. So it's like a visual evidence, and this paper or this presentation will examine the colonial interference and how it influenced and formed this particular layer of this cultural visual evidence. So considering France and Britain colonial attitudes, the British influence on Egypt left traces on the local architecture, and the cities will be investigated and discussed in this presentation. So what is colonialism? The definition. So basically it's a series of relationships between colonized and colonizers in diverse and global relationships. So to make it very simple, it's like a strong link and a weaker link, and the stronger link having an authority on the weaker link for the primary goal of using its raw material and controlling it, such as men, plants, minerals, animals, and benefiting over that for the small group of the stronger link. So it's a system that appropriates to exploit, if you can say. And every system has phases. So colonialism went through two major phases since the 15th century. The first phase was focused on trade, while the second phase was more focused on technological and military in nature. The first phase it lasted from the 15th to the 18th century, and Spain and Portugal were the leading colonial forces here, and they focused on trade. So the main part of it was trading crops. The second phase, when the European nation reverted to military intervention to defend their interests during the second period of colonialism, with England leading the way, followed by France. The eastern half of the Arab world was ruled by Britain, while the western half, North Africa, was ruled by France. But this phase was overly militarily motivated and strategic interest to control raw materials and outlets for European industries. Appropriation, as we said, colonialism is a system that appropriates to exploit. So what do we mean by to appropriate? To take or use often without permission, or to set apart for a particular use. So appropriation is a concept or belief that white educated Western noblemen own the world. Basically, it's just like white men own the world with the idea and objectification that therefore they can distribute people land and objects for their own needs. So also how they portrayed colonization in books and articles and history. It all leads to the appropriation by a Western region willing to bring disparate and distant together. For even architecture, they wanted to display for the visitors the amusement and enlightenment of the space. So it was from the perspective of the white Western white man. This is an illustration from a report or a journal that shows it's a point of view of the white Western man. Architecture as a system of appropriation. Urbanism and architecture. And the architecture in the first phase of colonialism was a functional order that they used the raw materials and they used the local ways of construction on the original lands. Thus, during the 19th century, the process of colonization was perfected and they started using more the European methods. In architecture, a two-way movement of importation and exportation characterized the colonial period. Even when they discovered a lot of Egyptian art, they would post it, or they would it would feature on Vogue Europe on magazines as their own. Like they would share it as their own, not as like Egypt. They would share it as their own. And when they discovered the Tutankhamun tomb, they posted it as their own. They marketed it as their own. So I want to comment more on that they wanted to show people that they were in control of the space and they own it. Well, they're not. This is why the European architects were very obsessed with the heritage of Algeria and India as an inspiration period for their diversity. So their fascination with the style, that having styles coming from very different lands, then combining it with the European style, created this picturesque, exotic style that they really loved and they appreciated during that era. So people started traveling and were around to showcase their Arabic art collection and the way they wanted to construct this Arabic style. So basically they marketed the Arabic style in Europe and they marketed the European style in Arab countries. At the same time, the colonialism thought to impose the European way on other nations in the name of humanity and civilization. So they thought that them doing this and dominating the space is a sign of humanity and civilization. So they started building these like quarters, these European quarters in the city, and they would create one like a European suburb next to a very local Egyptian suburb, and like with very huge difference, and would create a very weird interaction with them. Like this, the Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo. So the French and British colonizers' urban policy consisted of demolishing indigenous settlements, cutting avenues through the original fabric, and constructing European cities next to the old ones as seats of control for the European colonizers. This same policy was used by the French, it was repeated in the 19th century again in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunis. So a new colonial urban type was developed by portraying the two cities. The two seemingly unrelated towns has been connected only by their proximity. The British and the French attitude. I wanted to discuss the British and the French attitude not only in Egypt, because when it comes to Egypt, it's a very specific case. But I wanted to like comment on how they affected other parts of the Arab world. How I wanted to talk about how the French attitude really had a direct effect on Algeria, as they demolished a lot of important settlements like the Kasbahs, and they replaced it with Western-style structures. So, and also when there was a large number of Europeans settling in Algeria, the French government started to create new neighborhoods of geometric grids that is made out of a very new classical style of architecture. So basically they changed the whole architectural typology from the Algerian local type to the neoclassical. So they destroyed the old architecture and the heritage of the architecture typology, and it was purely European now. Also, the British attitude on India when Britain set its foot on India, they wanted to create and change the cities of India and make it more European-like. So the urban policies on Bombay and Calcutta consisted of mixing a planned European city that clashed with an indigenous town. The two towns were racially divided, but the architecture was purely European. Like they demolished any kind of old Indian architecture, and it was mainly purely European. No, because Egypt experience stands out of this context because it did not have a very direct change. And no, they did add new towns and new cities, but it was not very direct. That's what happened in Algeria and in India. On the other hand, the ruler Muhammad Ali and his successors, they wanted many cities like Iskandariya or Cairo to be modernized. So they were increasing the European influence. And after Egypt became a British protectorate in 1882, it was not technically a colony, but it was governed and administered by the British, who took in charge of the economy and of the army, and it had an army troops there. The cityscape and the architecture was already transformed and influenced by European influences, and it became more European. But like the question we're gonna ask ourselves, what is the transformation? Is it just them influencing like the ruler to modernize it, or there was like an actual direct impact? So my first case study, or not case study, or the city I want to talk about is Iskandaria. Iskandaria had a strong European community that was a part of the cosmopolitan population before the British conquest. It has the main Egyptian port and the second capital, and it was the first city to feel the effects of large number of foreigners who settled there, because it was the very important port on the Mediterranean Sea. For a lot of foreigners was attracted to that space from Greece, Italy, France, Syria, that engaged in trade and other skilled services. Unlike the other regions, Iskandariya was colonized successfully really early on. So the city had a lot of changes in the spatial distribution. So they created like a European quarter in that city. So you'd have like the original town, then they're gonna be the European quarter with this very luxurious spaces. Like they'd have gardens, they'd have banks, foreign schools, shops, and the royal families and the very rich foreigners would live there. And this like created type of classism, because you'd see هنا بكون عندنا like the rest of the town هون بيجي this quarter for the rich, and they would neglect the needs of the other parts of the town. They would only focus on the European quarter. The second city is Cairo. Cairo did not have مش زي اسكندرية إنه كان عندي it's a main port and كان يجي عندي foreigners جايين عليها. This influence was more of the Khidawi Ismail, that he wanted to evoke an European city in the capital. The architecture was designed by Haussmann style that followed an Italian-French neoclassical trend. After the increasing of growth and popularity of this space, which is Cairo, two new districts, At-Tawfiqiyya and Al-Hilmiyya, were developed in adjacent to the European city of Ismail that he built. إنه كان عندنا old Cairo and like new Cairo, the European city, and like the new two districts that is that added to the existing network. As I said, a vast number of people started to grow more interest in that space, and they needed to start building. The Khidawi Ismail wanted to start building more of these European quarters. Even though there was a vast number of Egyptian architects, but he wanted European architects to be in charge of the design. So he preferred French architects who worked for both the royal family and the private investors, the foreigners and the bankers, that they created this style of new classical Arabic style that was a mix of Moorish and Ottoman elements in a new classical composition. And foreigners really preferred this style, and it helped to develop Cairo and make it more of a combination of this old city with this new city and make it as one. Due to the vast growing of migration to Cairo and the arrival of great number of Europeans, the city population grew and rents increased and more quarters became Europeanized. يعني هلا Cairo at this period we're talking بطل في عنا كتير like local towns. صار أغلبيته colonized أو Europeanized, as we're gonna say. They started to neglect these local areas and they abandoned it for the wealthier parts of the city. Meanwhile, the appropriation process of the new city was completed at this area. No new houses were built for the poorer class, and new neighborhoods were planned for the affluent residents. Although the British power did not have a very direct effect on Cairo, but they built an army and a functional buildings for their interests in Cairo. Heliopolis, it's a city that was designed to be a garden city by a Belgian entrepreneur that he wanted to create this concept of respecting the local tradition but while appropriating and dominating the region. So he used a very Arab way of building, using the natural elements of everything, while also trying to create create appropriation and dominating. This is the banner of the advertisement for the Heliopolis Palace Hotel in 1930, and this is a back and front of the Heliopolis Palace Hotel and the residential palace. During the 20th century, Cairo witnessed a lot of growth of new neighborhoods مثل الزمالك ومدينة الماضي. At this time, entrepreneurs built something called the Garden City of Zamalek. This had occupied the royal family, the Qasr al-Ali. It was a very attractive, spectacular space. It was a very luxurious neighborhood of larger residents surrounded by gardens in the circular city, attracted high-ranking foreigners, and who started to build villas around it. So my conclusions are that the foreign Europeans has appropriated both the capital Cairo and the second capital Iskandaria, not to mention the cities along the Suez Canal, where they completely controlled by the French-British company. The appropriation was achieved through a visual sign of architecture and urban planning by imposing a European style of architecture. This occurred with the approval of Egyptian rulers who مثل اللي حكينا الخديوي محمد علي الخديوي إسماعيل, who eagerly adopted this as a sign of modernism and passed it to the Egyptian upper class and subsequently to all classes. Two, the actual control and power of the foreigners had reached unsurpassed heights, and the city urbanscape reflected this submission to Europe and its representatives, communities residing in Egypt. The Europeans achieved a symbolic domination of Egypt through appropriation of the city and its architecture. Three, the foreign presence in Egypt, the British among many, left traces on the architecture and the cities. The visual traces are often the most powerful reminder and visual evidence of the colonial interference that altered and shaped a layer of the cultural and physical environment. Thank you.